So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we are going to continue our Lenten journey through the book of Lamentations, another kind of rough chapter this week. So, we're going to be looking at Lamentations chapter 2. And so, a couple of the kind of just themes or starting questions I want us thinking about as we do this kind of Lectio style reading in a second here, and as we're doing our own meditations on this chapter as a whole, are what does anger look like in your life? What types of things make you anger? How do you tend to express anger? Do you feel comfortable expressing anger? Because the second chapter deals with a lot of anger at the situation, at the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, at the exile that the just sheer suffering people are experiencing. I think this chapter has a lot to do with people when they are just angry at the circumstances in the world, and that kind of question that so many of us ask of just where is God? What is God's responsibility in this? And I think that second question is one that's going to haunt this passage as well. Is whereas the first chapter was largely describing kind of the desolation that the city was compared to these various women in these awful situations, and it had this kind of empty, hollow, mourning feeling. This chapter is much more active, and it blames God very specifically for the horrors that are being experienced here. And so, as we go into this chapter, I think we just need to spend a little time reflecting on kind of these questions: is what does anger look like for me? How do I express it? How comfortable am I with my own anger at others and at the world, and especially at God? And as well, we need to confront some of our just assumptions on how active God actually is in the world. I think we as a culture, as children of the Enlightenment and kind of modern philosophy, tend to lean culturally toward a fairly absent God. Most of us, even those of us who follow God, are going to want to focus on kind of God's work in our inner being, right? In the ways we feel, the things we sort of think, and how that, those lenses change and shape the world. The other extreme, of course, is people who feel God that feel that God is very active in the world. And I've met people that who see everything as spiritual when they stub their toe, when they can't get a parking ticket. That's obviously God is angry at them, or demons are involved, that sort of thing. And so, on that range, take a second of reflection. Just say, okay, what is my default? What do I kind of default to? Is how active is God in the day to day? How active is God in world history? Is God fairly hands off and allowing people to kind of make our own choices? Is God very active and tinkering with things constantly? Is it something that's in between those? Because both of those assumptions, I think, are going to be with us as we look at this section particularly, and the rest of Lamentations totally. So again, I'm just going to read 6 or 7 of these verses out of Lamentation. I think they give us the sense of what this chapter is about. But I would encourage you, in your own reading, your own reflection, to pull out a Bible and sit with the entire chapter. It's a little overwhelming. The kind of sampling I'm giving here gives us a good sense of what this chapter is doing, what it feels like, where the anger towards God comes from. But read the entire thing. It's very, very well written, as I mentioned, and it has this kind of cyclical thing as anger and rage and mourning often does. We keep returning to the same thoughts and issues. It feels scattered, like somebody does when we are in pain. So let's take one moment. I'm going to read this through kind of twice, quietly, as we'll do on Sunday. And the question, of course, we're asking ourselves is, do any images stick out to us? What is the overall feel? What might God be saying to us in this confusing, angry, and not very spiritual sounding passage that is largely raging at God and blaming God for things that are going poorly? So this is the first 6 verses of Lamentations, chapter 2. Has the Master beclouded in his wrath the daughter of Zion, has flung from the heavens to the ground the splendor of Israel, nor did he recall his footstool on the day of his wrath? The master obliterated, had no mercy, all of Jacob's dwellings, brought to the ground, profaned a kingdom and its nobles. He hacked down in smoldering wrath the whole horn of Israel, pulled back his right hand, but before the enemy, and burned in Jacob like a white-hot fire, consuming all around. Like an enemy he bent his bow, poised with right hand like a foe, and slayed all precious to the eye in the tent of Zion's daughter, poured forth like fire his fury. The master has become like an enemy, obliterated Israel, obliterated her citadels, laid in ruins her fortresses, and made abundant in Judah's daughter wailing and woe. He has stripped bare his shelter like a garden, laid in ruins his appointed place. The Lord wiped out the memory in Zion of festival and Sabbath, and spurned in his raging wrath king and priest. How has the master beclouded in his wrath the daughter of Zion, has flung from the heavens to the ground the splendor of Israel, nor did he recall his footstool on the day of his wrath. The master obliterated, had no mercy, all of Jacob's dwellings, brought to the ground, profaned a kingdom and its nobles. He hacked down in smoldering wrath the whole horn of Israel, pulled back his right hand from before the enemy, and burned in Jacob like a white-hot fire, consuming all around. Like an enemy he bent his bow, poised with right hand like a foe, and slayed all precious to the eye in the tent of Zion's daughter, poured forth like fire his fury. The master became like an enemy, obliterated Israel, obliterated her citadels, laid in ruins her fortresses, and made abundant in Judah's daughter wailing and woe. He stripped bare his shelter like a garden, laid in ruins his appointed place. The Lord wiped out the memory in Zion of festival and Sabbath, and spurned in his raging wrath king and priest. So the questions I did want us to sit with again in this chapter are, like what is our default? What is our default when something difficult happens? Who do we look to blame? Do we lash out at others? Do we blame other people? Do we blame ourselves? Do we kind of hunker down and stop feeling things in their entirety? Do we look for someone to blame, someone to become angry at? And then the question again is, what is our assumption on how interactive God is with his creation? I will just kind of throw out there some of my own thoughts on that, just because this is something that I've been chewing on lately, not just in this, but in just some of the other readings I'm doing and some of the work I'm doing for school right now. And just this very common description we have of God as, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-in-control, right? It's just the assumption of what God is in many people's minds. And so for many people, the difficulty comes with situations like this. The pain that is experienced in the world. I've actually had two different people mention lately to me that they struggle to follow and believe in God because they see, cancer in children, these awful things that are going on in the world, genocides, etc. There is a lot of just filth in the world. People do some really terrible things to one another. And the question is, if God is all powerful and all caring, is he just too weak to do something about it? Or is God actually responsible for this in some way, shape, or form? And I would say my default position is that God is a little bit more hands-off, because does God care deeply? Absolutely. And yet, my reading of the Bible is that God is not incapable of doing things. It's just that the amount of work that would be required to do, he would basically have to take this out of humanity's hands and entirely to actually fix the wrong that is in the world. God seems more interested in allowing us autonomy and the free will and the power to do both good and harm in the world, so that we can do real harm to one another, that we can do real harm to the world. And I think our continued choices to do otherwise often does cause some of those things that it seems like God is doing directly. Sometimes, whether it's an ecological disaster, whether it's disease in the world, those are things that we want God to be directly involved in. God, would you please just snap your fingers and fix this? And there are good people out there who pray and expect God to do those things, and yet we don't always get the answer we want to. I will not pretend to understand like I have answers for those situations. But I think my read on the Bible is that God is in fact active in the world. He will not always, like a genie, fix things. I don't know why. I don't know why good, true prayers, or at least what seem like it to me, don't seem to be answered all the time. But my understanding overall is that the immense suffering in the world is often um, because God values humanity's autonomy. God loves humanity and wants us to follow and choose and to do the work alongside Him of making the world a very different place than we often get. And I just think of, the word in here that is used so oftenly is the master. No master of apprentices will get apprentices that grow up and take responsibility for things if he just simply does everything for them. And yet, on the other side, we get passages like this where, the person in their anger is very much blaming God for what happened. And the Bible holds these two just kind of positions in a kind of a tension, because we know biblically that the reason this destruction, this brutality happened to this people was in many ways their own fault. God has warned them about the injustice, the way they treat one another, the fact that they are a small country surrounded by massive empires who are gobbling up these small countries, right? And that they will be gobbled up if they try to rely on their own political savvy, if they try to, to reach out after any power, any god that seems like it could offer some kind of a support. God says, no, these things are bigger than you, and I will protect you, but you need to trust me. You need to do things my way. And the Bible is very clear they refuse to, and God kind of removes his hands in some ways, and that they have brought a lot of this destruction on themselves. And yet, at the same time, the Bible is also pretty clear that God is active and is involved, and God is taking some responsibility for the darkness in the world and using it, in this case, for judgment. They have done some really awful things to one another that God is not going to tolerate. God is not going to tolerate his children treating each other in the ways that the world does. And it's hard to reconcile those two pieces, and I can't pretend like I can down to this day. But those are the kind of two pieces in tension that we see in this space. That God takes responsibility for the way the world is, not full responsibility, because it's not like that everything is going just the way God desires. The Bible's very clear on that. That autonomy causes God immense pain because he allows us to harm one another and to harm ourselves. And at the same time, God uses those things, and God is active on both the healing and the wholeness side, which is what I want to focus on, right? But also at times on the judgment and breaking things that need breaking, which many times includes us. Does not explain the details, the awfulness of things like children getting cancer or the just seeming chaos and destruction in the world by any means. But to me, those are the kind of two pieces that we hold in tension. And so when we are in that tension, I think this passage invites us to a very interesting place. I think there is a culture in many churches and many people's spiritual lives that this kind of blind trust, these kind of epithets of, God brings good from all suffering, or whatever the verse is that I should probably know better. I get that. I've had that verse quoted to me many times when I've been in the midst of the darkness. And I believe that God can bring good things out of any amount of suffering and darkness, but I don't think that means God causes it. I don't think that means God is championing it or believing in it. And yet again, when destruction like this passage we just looked at, where God is very active, and there's so many mentions in here of the destruction happening to something that is beloved to God. This is his beloved country. This is his beloved people. And yet he's allowed this, and he has actively been involved in this deconstruction, in this destruction of these people. And so I think there are many times that people will think that they're being very spiritual by just blindly trusting God, saying, "No, I'm okay with the way the world is. Um, Everything is okay. God will just bring some good out of it." And I struggle with that. I think there are some people that can genuinely suffer and just trust in God and have a sense of inner peace and a sense of inner joy. And I think there are people that are pretending to be just that, but in fact are too comfortable and are too sheltered and are not experiencing both that sorrow of the world within themselves or the sorrows of those around them. They've isolated themselves from suffering and from pain. And so the question, of course, becomes like this person, how honest are we with both ourselves and with God about the suffering and the pain in the world? What is the place of anger in our spiritual lives? Can we think of people who lashed out at God? And I see many of my heroes in the Bible, people like Moses and Elijah, the minor prophets, even Jesus himself at times, lashing out in anger at the way death and destruction and sin are in the world. And they do recognize that God has some responsibility for it. And you read something like Job and the almost embarrassing things he is willing to say to God and blame God for, right? And so I think there are some people out there who can have a sense of deep inner joy and trust of God in all circumstances. And may we all grow into those people no matter what life and the world throw at us. But I also think that is not only okay, but it shows a deeper trust between us, ourselves, and God when we are willing to be honest and say, you know what, I am pissed off about the harm in the world. I'm pissed off about the things that are going on in my life or I see out there in the world. It doesn't feel fair. It doesn't feel right. I don't understand why you allow things to be the way they are. And I think that honesty, that even sometimes just rage, is something that God both welcomes and can take. He has had this thrown at him many times. He takes this responsibility, even when we don't understand the reasoning and such things for it. And so I think passages like this, some of us don't feel a lot of anger at the world. Some of us feel immense anger. And I think what we need to be able to sit with is my anger being thrown at God in a way that would allow for trust at the end of it? Is my anger being thrown at in the world in a way that allows it to turn into energy and healing and the chance to make things better? Or is it simply just adding to the filth, the destruction in the world overall? I don't know. There are no easy questions in passages like this, but I just think we need to ask ourselves again and be truly honest. Like, what is the source of my anger at times? Am I comfortable bringing this to God? Am I comfortable trusting God when I don't totally understand and believing that God, whether he is highly active in this situation, whether he's a little more hands off and allowing our autonomy, will this ultimately end in trust, which I think at times prayers like this, laments, an open eyed acknowledgement of what the world actually is, are necessary for inviting God into the darkness of the world and into the pain of the world, which is, of course, what Lamentations overall is about, which is, of course, what Lent is about, which is what the cross is about, that God took pain and anger and sin and death and darkness into himself so that he could bring resurrection, so that he could bring something beyond all those things. So, yeah, this is a passage that I feel like I got a little roughed up about. Maybe you can too, but hopefully on Sunday we can struggle through some of these things together, and who knows, maybe we can even get to that point of quiet trust, even joy, despite an open-eyed look at what the world actually is.